Alright, back at it again. Boston Massacre. More British soldiers were sent to the colonies to stop the protests and to prevent further unrest. Eventually, about 4,000 British soldiers, equal to 1/4 of Boston's population, were sent. So they send in 4,000 British troops to Boston, which is also about 1/4 of the population there. So that's quite a few troops to be sending into a population of which you equal 1/4 of it. That's 1/4 of it. Their presence added to the growing bitterness between the colonists and the British government. The soldiers were poorly paid. Many worked at part-time jobs to meet their basic needs. In doing so, they were taking jobs needed by the colonists. Bad feelings reached a boiling point in 1770 when a group of people in Boston taunted the soldiers and threw snowballs. By accident, the soldiers fired and several protesters were killed. Now what ends up happening is, well, you have 4,000 people who come in to a town. Of course, you're going to be needing a job and a way to live. So if you're not being paid by the British Army very well, you need to take up a second job, so to speak. Well, the problem with that is you're taking jobs from who else? The colonists. So what ends up happening is you're allowing the British troops to come in and take for those jobs, but you're putting a colonist out of a job, so to speak. So once again, bitterness, resentment, anger, a boiling point, and what ends up happening? Well, they go out. Some people are just maybe letting off a little bit of steam, not trying to be harmful, so to speak, but they end up throwing snowballs. Well, by accident, a soldier fires, and it all comes unglued. So the next thing is that several protesters were killed, unfortunately. It's not a good thing, okay? Crispus Attucks, a man of mixed African and Native American Indian ancestry, was the first colonist killed, okay? Crispus Attucks. Please take note of that name. John Adams was a man who was a young attorney who represented the soldiers that were on trial. Now, Adams argued that the soldiers acted in self-defense and that they were found to be innocent. Nevertheless, his cousin Samuel Adams and other opponents of British rule called this incident the Boston Massacre. They circulated pictures and used this tragedy to win public support against the British. So we're starting to see this kind of terror in the colonies. We're on one hand seeing a little bit of a rebellion, but on the other we're trying to see some people who are trying to remain loyal. So a loyalist is someone who still very highly enjoys the idea of King George III and his rule, whereas a patriot is someone who's fighting for a cause, which could be a one of the rebellion. Okay. In 1772, Samuel Adams formed the first committee of correspondence with James Warren and his wife, Mercy Otis Warren. Mary wrote a series of pamphlets and satires against the British. The new committee of correspondence organized opponents of British policies throughout the colonies. With her husband off fighting, Mercy wrote the first history of the American Revolution War using notes from meetings and conversations. Her ideas and writings convinced many of the people in the colonies to take up the patriot cause. So it's not just men. Women too are taking place in this patriotic cause. I find that very interesting, because back then women did not have the rights such as men, and so to see a woman who's still taking up and standing by the side of her husband is a very noble thing in my eyes, and I'm very interested in that. Now the Tea Duty and the Boston Tea Party. Now the Tea Duty, we all are aware of it, was a special tax that was placed on tea, and we had a group called the Boston Tea Party who snuck in, and they were dressed as Mohawk Indians, and they ended up boarding three British ships in Boston Harbor and seized 45 tons of tea. And what did they do with it? Well, they ended up throwing it overboard, and it all went into the Boston Harbor. Yay. Now, due to this, there was a lot of unrest, a lot of consequences that were going to come from this. The Intolerable Acts, because of the Boston Tea Party, brought a strong reaction from the British government. The Intolerable Acts were placed. Now, the Intolerable Acts closed the Boston Harbor until the people of Boston paid for the lost tea, but it also restricted the freedom of citizens in Massachusetts by eliminating the elected government council. So, although we are upset with the British Tea Act, what ends up happening is we go in, we knock some tea off board, but because British has lost all of that money, all of that tea, the money that was associated with the tea, well, what do? Well, they say, hey, A, you're going to pay for this because you broke it, and because of that, we're going to take away all of your elected government councils. So they come in and they take over. Now, the king also assumed the power to appoint all positions in the government of the colonies. So, A, he's taking elected governments, that self-government feel, from the people and placing in his own people to make sure that things are running accordingly to King George. Now, these steps greatly increased tensions between the colonists and Great Britain. Lastly, the British government declared the right to quarter or house British soldiers in the unoccupied buildings in the colonies. Now, if you can remember back, they ended up bringing 4,000 troops into Boston. Due to that, you've got to have a place to put all of those people. Now, at the time, they were trying to house them in whichever ways they could. Due to the fact that they did not have the means of making money, because they're trying to make money because of the French and Indian War, they start putting people in houses. They start putting their troops in other people's houses against their will. So imagine putting 1 or 2 more troops into your house. How would that make you feel? How would it make you feel if they ended up taking your bed and your room? You also had to feed all of these people. So depending on how many people were put into your house, you had to feed them, you had to lodge them, take care of them, make sure that they were getting treated well. Because if you weren't, all they had to do was go back and say, hey, these people are not being nice to me, and guess what? Punishment is served. The Quebec Act. At the same time, the British government passed the Quebec Act. This act guaranteed the rights of the French in Canada to follow the Catholic religion. It also gave the Ohio Territory to Quebec and strengthened the power of royal officials in Quebec. These steps only served to further anger the American colonists. So, thinking back and applying what we've learned. Civil disobedience is a refusal to obey a law we think is unjust. In what way was the Boston Tea Party an example of civil disobedience? Do you think that the act of civil disobedience was justified? And 2, make your own poster giving the British or colonial view in these disputes. So if you want to make a very small poster on 1 sheet of paper and turn that in as an extra grade, I will greatly anticipate you creating a poster for that. Make sure that it is something that will be displayed around the room, so make sure that you put effort into it and a little bit of color if you don't mind. Page 95, you need to go through and describe each of the milestones along the road to the American Revolution. So this goes back through all of those acts that we've talked about, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, Townshend Acts, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, and then finally with the Intolerable Acts that we just talked about. So make sure that you finish up with page 95. Also, pages 96 up at the top. Now, the road to independence. The First Continental Congress. In 1774, representatives from the colonies met in Philadelphia to discuss their common concerns of the growing crisis. This assembly, known as the First Continental Congress, decided to continue protesting British taxes. They felt that the government had failed to redress or remedy colonial grievances. So the colonists are feeling that essentially Great Britain is not taking care of them. They feel like they are being treated unfairly, and that it is just not going how they want it. Lexington and Concord. In April of 1775, open warfare finally broke out between British soldiers and colonial militia known as Minutemen. It began when British soldiers were sent to Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts to arrest several Patriot leaders and to capture a suspected storehouse of weapons. No one is sure who fired the first shots, but it was the shot heard around the world. This event marked the start of the American Revolution. So, the question is, what was the event that marked the beginning of the American Revolution? Well, it was the shots that were heard around the world, which is Lexington and Concord. Excuse me. The struggle spreads. In May, colonial representatives met again in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. All of the colonies sent delegates to Philadelphia, which included John and Samuel Adams from Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania, and Thomas Jefferson from Virginia. The delegates quickly voted to join Massachusetts in its fight. In Williamsburg, Virginia, Patrick Henry, considered the finest orator in America, convinced the House of Burgesses to support the war with his stirring speech, "Give me liberty or give me death." Although the Second Continental Congress lacked the legal authority to govern, it boldly assumed that responsibility. The Continental Congress appointed George Washington, a Virginian who had fought in the French and Indian War, to lead the Continental Army. The selection of a Virginian helped to unify the colonies. Washington proceeded directly to Boston. In March, using cannons that were captured from Ethan Allen at Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, Washington drove the British out of Boston. The British retreated to New York City. Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Now, Thomas Paine is an Englishman living in the colonies, and he had published a pamphlet called Common Sense in early 1776. Paine believed it was ridiculous for America to be governed by a small, distant island across the vast ocean. He said that the colonists derived no benefit from British rule. In fact, the British dragged the colonists into European wars. Many patriots who were supporters of the Revolution began to demand complete independence. And so it was a thanks to Thomas Paine's Common Sense where they were basically saying, hey, we need to really think about this and use some common sense and say, hey, we need to get away from this little small island across the ocean. The Declaration of Independence. Representatives from the Second Continental Congress began discussing the issue of American independence early in 1776. John Adams played an important role as leader of the movement for separation from England. A Virginian, Richard Henry Lee, proposed that the colonies declare their independence. Adams seconded the motion. After much debate, the delegates decided to declare their independence from Britain. Thomas Jefferson, working as part of a small committee that included John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, wrote most of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams led the debate in the Continental Congress. Much of our knowledge about the debates in the Continental Congress comes from the stream of letters between Adams and his wife, Abigail Adams. Her letters reveal a woman of keen intelligence with strong opinions. Her writings reveal a commitment to voting rights for women and African Americans and fierce support for American independence. So once again, we have a very strong, independent, intelligent woman who's making herself known in this time where they did not have many rights. So once again, very interesting. Major ideas of the Declaration. The document, based on July 4, 1776, explained the reasons why the colonists sought independence from Great Britain. Following the ideas of John Locke, who was the quote-unquote a freedom writer, awakening of sorts, Jefferson explained that the government was a social contract. It proposes ways to protect citizens' unalienable rights, which are rights that are given by the grace of God, not by king, not by man, but by God when you are birthed. They are rights that should not be taken away from citizens, including the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This philosophy also teaches that each individual is endowed at birth with rights that are unalienable because they were given to us by our Creator. This idea of unalienable rights became a basic belief of American government, that some rights are derived from nature and may not be taken or violated by the government. The Declaration of Independence went on to list the grievances of the colonists against King George III and his ministers. Most of these grievances related to the belief that the British Crown was threatening the colonists' right in favor of tyrannical rule, of being, once again, a rule by a tyrant. Now, if you read over the little bit of text boxes on page 99, you'll read through those. And I'm going to move on to the road to victory. Now, in the first years of the war, the colonial army barely managed to escape disaster. Washington and the Continental Army occupied New York City in 1776. However, the British drove Washington and his army out of New York after the long Battle of Long Island. British troops then occupied New York City. The British next defeated Washington at the Battle of White Plains. He managed to keep his army intact and retreated across the Delaware River. In December of 1776, hoping to catch Hessian mercenaries, which were German-hired troops, by surprise, he recrossed the Delaware at night and defeated them at the Battle of Trenton. So he escapes across the river, takes his time, bites his tongue, and says, what do I need to do next? And decides that it is in favor of independence for him to cross, once again, that river. And he takes the Hessian mercenaries, which are the German-hired mercenaries, by surprise in the wee hours of the morning. Now, the victory assured Washington's continued command as head of the Continental Army, and it raised morale against the colonists. Okay, if you could, I would like for you to read over the Acting as an Amateur Historian on page 100, and make sure that you are ready to discuss that come Tuesday. The Battle of Saratoga. While the colonists were debating for their future independence, British troops remained in New York City. The British had a plan to win the war by dividing the colonies in two through New York. A divided America would be easier to defeat. 3 British armies were there to meet in the middle of the colony. However, British General Howe delayed the plan when he first left New York City to attack Philadelphia instead of marching directly north. The second British force turned back instead of marching along the Mohawk River. The plan then entirely failed when the largest army, commanded by General John Burgoyne, was defeated at Saratoga in 1777 by General Horatio Gates. General Burgoyne was unprepared because, like many British generals, he held the erroneous belief that the rebels were ignorant farmers who could easily be swept away by highly trained British regulars. Now, there was the idea that back then, the British Army, on paper, was by far the best. They were undefeated for most of everything, and they went in with this belief that they were just going to easily take us out. The problem was, well, what did the Americans have going for them at the time? What did the colonists have going for them? Well, if you can think back to it, they were just common people who picked up a gun. Very little training, but they had a belief. And that belief is what powered them to overcome many of the obstacles upon with which they were set. Now, one of those who were fighting in Saratoga was church leader, historian, and judge Wentworth Cheswell. Cheswell is considered the first African American elected to public office in America. The Battle of Saratoga marked a turning point in the war. The victory at Saratoga helped Ben Franklin and John Adams, who had been sent overseas to persuade the French government to supply military assistance to the Americans. Now, key thing to take away from this Battle of Saratoga. 3 British armies coming in. Each one of them decides to kind of do their own thing. The biggest army out of them all is defeated . Now, with that big army defeated, the Battle of Saratoga then marks the turning point for the war. Now, the winter of 1777 and 1778 at Valley Forge. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Essentially, Valley Forge was a camp where Washington ends up making the decision to camp out, to kind of rest, take a few minutes. The problem was it was during the winter. Many of his men did not have proper clothing, proper boots, proper tents. The wives who were following the army were coming in to help do the best that they could, cooking dinners, things of that nature. But one of the main pieces of information to take away from this is Marquis de Lafayette, who was a volunteer from France who helped train the soldiers in the Continental Army. So he came over to help out. Okay. Although the French king forbid him going to the America because France was not at war with England, Lafayette purchased a ship and gathered a group of French officers to help in the struggle. His volunteer service was seen as a major triumph for the American cause. So we had gone over, we had asked for assistance from the French. The French were able to give us this assistance, and Lafayette and a group of his men purchased a ship, sailed across, came in, helped train our troops on what it meant to be smarter and more prepared veterans of warfare. Now, the war in the South. After the Battle of Saratoga, most of the fighting moved to the south. The British thought southern landowners would be sympathetic to England. The American Revolution also became an international war. Not only France, but also Spain allied with the colonists against Britain. Bernardo de Galvez helped the Americans by shipping them supplies. He commanded Spanish troops against the British in Louisiana and protected the city of New Orleans from British attack. Later, he defeated British troops in Florida. Ham Solomon was a successful Jewish merchant and banker who had immigrated from Poland. He helped finance Washington's campaign. Solomon gave loans to the new government. He extended interest-free private loans to the nation as well as to key revolutionary leaders. The colonists were also assisted by James Armistead, an African-American slave who acted as a spy. Yeah, I cannot talk today, guys. I'm sorry. General Lafayette was in desperate need of reliable information about enemy movements. Armistead began posing as an escaped slave, which allowed him to travel freely between both armies. He acted as an orderly and guide to the British, and then sent back what he learned to Lafayette. So James Armistead, African American, was able to infiltrate the mighty British Army and act as a guide, but at the same time as a spy for the American troops. Okay, we're almost done. We've got a couple more things to read over. Now, the War of the Seas, John Paul Jones became America's first naval hero. Commanding the Bowman Richard, he faced a large British warship with more firepower. During the battle, the Jones was asked to surrender. He replied, "I've not yet begun to fight." Jones managed to win the battle, the first victory of an American warship. Jones' victory served to boost the morale of the colonists. So even on the ocean, we were still being able to put up a fight to the British, and we were able to win a couple of the battles. Finishing off the Battle of Yorktown, after several more years of fighting, General Washington managed, with French help, to force General Charles Cornwallis and the main British army into a corner at Yorktown, Virginia. The French fleet blocked their escape by sea. After a few days of combat, Cornwallis and his 8,000 British soldiers were forced to surrender in October. The Battle of Yorktown turned out to be the last major battle of the war. Occasional fighting continued after the surrender at Yorktown, and Washington feared the war might still drag on for another year. However, when word reached England of the defeat at Yorktown, the Prime Minister was forced to resign, and the new government decided to give up the fight. Independence was recognized in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which formally ended the American Revolutionary War. Under its terms, the British recognized the independence of the colonies. The British promised to remove all their troops from the country. In addition, they gave all land between the Mississippi River and the Atlantic, from the Great Lakes to the border with Florida, to the new United States. This move gave the nation twice the area of the former colonies. A variety of factors were responsible for the American Revolution War, and the world's richest and most powerful empire. So read through on 103 the little text box and make sure that you're ready to discuss that. Now, this marks the end of the Chapter 7 read. I do hope that you go back and look at the concept map as well as the study cards, and you're ready to read over the questions to promote a successful read and discussion come Tuesday. Make sure that you are doing what is needed. All right. Thank y'all for being here with me, and I'll see y'all on Tuesday. Thanks.